So the past year, I think, has been a year of living dangerously, when, of course, the headlines have been dominated by the COVID crisis, but also a year when fears of international tensions, particularly in our region, have been becoming more and more apparent. And I think one symptom of those issues has been a proliferation of reports about foreign influence, interference, and so on in Australian politics, academia, media, and other parts of society. The media have been reporting growing numbers of cases of academics and students being sometimes pressured or even harassed by outside sources. There have been repeated expressions of concern that research funding might be being used by foreign countries either to exert influence or to steal, research findings. And these have even been something that's been commented on by the Federal Police and ASIO. The reports on these subjects are sometimes couched in quite general terms and talk about things like, this was about academia, foreign states looking to exploit the sector's open and collaborative nature. But I think those sort of circumlocutions don't really fool anybody. As the University of Sydney China expert, Professor Salvatore Babones, explained, when ASIO refers to foreign states, it really means China. So this raises some important issues, I think. Should we be concerned about the ways in which the Chinese government tries to influence Australian academia? Absolutely, I would say. And should we be trying to develop better ways to identify the influence and limit its potentially harmful effects? And again, I think the answer is absolutely. But should we assume that foreign influence means Chinese influence? And I think that's where the story becomes more complex and in some ways more troubling. I think there are two problems with the simple, foreign influence equals China equation. And one is that it does create a risk that any academics who are dealing with China may be collaborating with scholars in China or receiving funding even from Chinese foundations may start to become the objects of suspicion, even almost be regarded as potential fifth columnists. But of course, a lot of the Australian academics who are dealing with China in that way are very independent-minded. A lot of them are very critical of the Chinese government. They're in a really difficult situation. And I think it's very important that they get support and encouragement rather than fear and suspicion. The second problem is that too much of a focus just on China diverts attention from foreign influence coming from other sources. And of course it's happening. I mean, of course there's foreign influence coming from all sorts of sources. As we are continuously told, our region is in the middle of a crucial shift in power. And the rise of an increasingly assertive China is creating tensions in many parts of the region. I think one of the problems is that when they speak about this, the Australian media and sometimes politicians and others as well tend to treat the whole power shift as though it were a sort of game of noughts and crosses, where it's China on the one side and Australia and its democratic allies on the other. And any win for China is a loss for us and vice versa. But I think a much better analogy is to think of it as being like what happens when a crucial seismic fault starts to shift. And when that happens, it's not just the movement along the main line of the fault, but you get a mass of other subsidiary cracks and shifts. So in other words, the rise of China and the response from other countries is creating a whole lot of political realignments within all the countries of the region, including, Japan, the two Koreas, India, the US and Australia, of course. So it's not noughts and crosses, it's much more like multiple games of chess being played on multiple boards by multiple players simultaneously. And we really need to be keeping our eye on all the pieces. So in this context, efforts by governments all over the region to influence academia, media reporting, and so on are intensifying, and they're taking on new forms as well. And I want to talk about a specific case which has very much, I've been very much involved with in the last month or so, which illustrates, I think, some of the issues that have been largely missed in the debate in Australia. This case doesn't directly involve Australia, it directly concerns Japan and the United States, but I think it has really significant implications for Australia and for other countries. And it's important to start by saying I'm not aiming to single out particular countries. On the contrary, I think the point that I want to make is it's not about singling out particular countries. And I'm going to talk about some issues related to Japan, but I'm not, of course, trying to say that Japan's efforts to influence academia in the US or anywhere, or Australia, are anywhere near as pervasive or as problematic as Chinese efforts. But the point is precisely that we need to stop focusing on one particular country. And I think what we need to do is to start focusing more within Australia on the systems that we have in place to protect academic integrity, and just making sure that they are as robust as they can be in order to resist possible influences that may come from a whole range of sources within Australia as well as outside. I'm going to start off with quite a bit of background, sort of going back to the Pacific War, and then I will come on to the current issue that I want to talk about. I need to start by going back to the history of the so-called comfort women, women recruited during the war to work in what were called comfort stations. They're terrible words, these, but I will use them, operated under the control of the Japanese military during the Asia-Pacific War. Very, very contentious topic, as you will know, but also a topic that has been researched quite thoroughly. So we have a reasonably good picture of what happened. What we know is that from the early 30s, but particularly from about 1937 onwards, the Japanese military established a large network of so-called comfort stations in the areas that it occupied. Many of these were operated by private contractors under the overall supervision of the military, but some were established and operated directly by the military themselves. We don't know how many women were recruited to these establishments, but certainly tens of thousands, quite possibly 100,000 or more. Some people put the estimate as high as 200,000. Initially, mostly women from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and a bit later China, who were often recruited by brokers. In some cases must have known the nature of the work they were going to, but there's good evidence that quite often they didn't, and they thought they were going to be nurses or waitresses or something. And in the later stages of the war then, women from Malaya, Indonesia, the Philippines, East Timor, Papua New Guinea, also some Dutch women were recruited, by force in some cases, and also by force in some cases in China. And, you know, we have the famous case of Jan Rafa Hearn, who passed away not so long ago, who was taken straight from a civilian detention center to a comfort station. Now, ever since the 1990s, as I'm sure you'll know, this has become an issue of huge controversy, particularly between Japan and South Korea. And the way in which it's been dealt with by the governments on both sides and by NGOs and so on both sides, I think has sometimes been quite problematic. So it's not a matter of, one side being always right and the other side being always wrong. And I think it's also important to say that the problem is the comfort women issue is just the tip of a larger kind of history wars iceberg, which deserves more attention than it's been getting. And I'll try and say a little bit about that. So in the early 1990s, the first former comfort women began to testify publicly about their experiences. And at that time, Japan conducted an investigation together with, in collaboration with the South Korean government. And in August 1993, Japan issued the Kono Statement, which acknowledged that the Japanese military had been involved in overseeing a large network of so-called comfort stations, had sometimes run them directly, and that some women had been recruited against their own will. And sometimes the military had been directly involved in the recruitment, not always, but sometimes. The Kono Statement went on to promise that we hereby reiterate our firm determination never to repeat the same mistake by forever engraving such issues in our memory through the study and teaching of history. Although this was, definitely a step in the right direction, it also produced a strong backlash within Japanese society from people who were unhappy about the content of the statement and very determined to prevent particularly this history being taught in Japanese schools. And quite a significant, or at least an influential section of conservative politics was involved in that, including Abe Shinzo, who later became prime minister, first from 2006 and then 2006 to 2007, and then from 2012 to 2020. During the Abe prime ministerships, the Japanese government expressed a sort of distance from the Kono Statement. It's never renounced or, stepped away from or, abandoned the Kono Statement. The official statement is that it inherits, the Japanese government inherits the Kono Statement, which isn't quite a ringing endorsement. But at the same time, the government has taken a number of steps which, in a sense, hollow out some of the content of that statement, particularly by denying that the Japanese military were involved in any coercive recruitment of comfort women. And the current position, which is very often repeated in official documents, is that no description directly showing forcible removal of comfort women by the army or government officials can be found. That's the official position of the Japanese government. I think that's contradicted by this historical evidence. Meanwhile, a network of interconnected non-state groups, sort of denialist groups, were proliferating in Japan. And particularly from about 2014 onwards, some of these groups embarked on quite a strenuous campaign of lobbying and really, in some cases, their members harassing or even threatening journalists and others in Japan who spoke out about this history, in a way sympathetic to the comfort women. And the result has been quite a stifling of public debate in the mainstream media in Japan, which a number of scholars have written about. Then in 2015, the Japanese government more than doubled its budget for what's called the strategic dissemination of information overseas, Senryaku-teki Taigai Hasshin. Now, this is a budget that's used for all sorts of things, most of which are quite conventional cultural diplomacy of the sort that every country does. But one of the explicit objectives is to convey what's called Japan's correct stance on history, and particularly on the history of the comfort women to the wider world. And that's done, again, to quote the official documents, by the cultivation of cohorts of people who are pro-Japanese or knowledgeable about Japan. Shinichi-ha no ikuse. Now, the precise use made of this budget is sometimes quite opaque. For example, in 2015, funds from Japan's strategic overseas dissemination budget helped to support 107 seminars internationally on territory and history and related issues. But as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson said at the time, there are actually numerous cases where it's not necessarily desirable for the involvement of the Japanese government to become known. And among these, there are also occasions when supportive think tanks run multiple seminars with the appearance that there is no financial support from the Japanese government. Meanwhile, the private, non-state, small but very vocal NGOs that I was mentioning, and you can see some of their logos and so on up there, became very active in disseminating messages denying the forced recruitment of comfort women overseas as well as in Japan. And these groups are quite varied. Some of them are quite closely linked to some kind of new religious groups. There are one or two, certainly one large Japanese corporation that gives quite a lot of support to some of these groups. As you can see, they tend to adopt rather, I would say, pseudo-scholarly English titles like the Society for the Dissemination of Historical Fact, the Historical Awareness Research Committee, the Global Alliance for Historical Truth, and my favorite one, the Japanese Women for Justice and Peace. And these send or their members or supporters send masses of emails with messages directed at people who speak out on behalf of the comfort women. As happened in Australia in 2016, 2017, when a Strathfield Council debated a proposal to build a monument, a memorial to the comfort women. And suddenly they got all these messages from these organizations that they had no idea what the organizations were. And ultimately the statue was built on private church land instead. But this kind of network of what I would call denialist groups focuses mainly on denying the forced recruitment of comfort women, but many have a much broader agenda, including denying the Nanjing massacre and quite broadly justifying Japan's wartime activities, arguing in quite a lot of cases that Japan was sort of an innocent victim provoked into war by Roosevelt for Roosevelt's own political purposes, and so on. Some also use what can only be called quite unorthodox measures to place pressure on foreign scholars who are doing serious research on the comfort women issue, and I can return to that in the discussion if you'd like to. So this is all background. Now, the specific issue, which has become a crisis in my research area, is this. So in December last year, this article appeared in an online peer-reviewed journal, the International Review of Law and Economics, by Professor J. Mark Ramsayer of Harvard Law School, Contracting for Sex in the Pacific War. In the article, Professor Ramsayer claims that the comfort women as a whole were commercial prostitutes who had signed contracts with their employers, which offered them relatively generous upfront payments and allowed them to return home once they'd paid off their debts. And this was sort of analyzing the logic, the economic logic of the contracts. A couple of weeks later, Professor Ramsayer published a similar article in an online news magazine published by a right-wing media group in Japan, expressing the same views in somewhat more straightforward terms, I guess. This evoked intense criticism, as you might imagine, from quite a large group of scholars and others, not just because of the very contentious conclusions, but even more really because critics argued that Ramsay had reached the conclusions basically by abandoning the principles of proper academic research. And a number of some of these links that I've got there are where the critics go through and point out some of the problems. For example, the fact that in this analysis of contracts, Professor Ramsay hadn't actually managed to produce a sample of a contract. There aren't, as far as we know, any that survive, or any testimony from anybody who'd signed a contract, or any testimony from anybody who'd seen a contract being signed. He basically pretty much ignored most of the existing research on the issue. He didn't talk at all about comfort women from places other than Japan and Korea. And checks of the referencing found masses of miscitations, sometimes misrepresentation of the content of sources, and sometimes sources that looked like academic sources but were actually online right-wing blogs. Which of course raises the question, how did this article get through a peer review process? I'm not going to go into that right now. We could maybe talk about that in the discussion. But I want to talk for a moment about the way in which this article is playing out in the wider political world. There were all these letters of protest, which I put up earlier. For example, over 3,500 economists, including more than 1,000 professors of economics, and including some Nobel Prize winners and a former chief economist of the World Bank Group, wrote a letter of protest saying that this article goes beyond mere academic failure or malpractice, and they say basically misuses economics to justify crimes against women in war. Now, lots of letters and messages and whatnot arrived in the offices of the editors of the journal. Most of them critical ones, demanding that the article be at least withdrawn and re-reviewed. But also things like a letter which was widely circulated from academics belonging to the Historical Awareness Research Committee, which is one of the ones I mentioned earlier. So I'm sure that the journal editors at first didn't know what this group was. They may have found out later. But it's one of the historical denialist groups. It's based at a small private Japanese university called Reitaku University. And it has been for some time focused on denying the forced recruitment of comfort women, and also things like the Nanjing massacre and so on. It's linked to a body called the Morology Foundation, whose history section employs the key members of some of the key members of the Historical Awareness Research Committee. And that in turn is linked to Nippon Kaigi, which you may have heard of, is one of the largest kind of right-wing lobby groups in Japan, to which many prominent politicians on the right belong. The comfort women issue by Professor Ramsay was actually just one of a series of equally contentious articles that he published or put up on his website at the same time. Two of them published in peer-reviewed journals. The other ones actually making quite derogatory remarks, I would say, about ethnic minorities or social minorities in Japan. These feed into ongoing debates in Japan's right-wing blogosphere, and they contain the same scholarly problems as the Comfort Women article. So all of these were instantly taken up by a network of denialist groups and were quoted all over the place. And they were taken up, obviously, by Korean bloggers as well. So the whole thing has really heated up conflicts between Japan and Korea, you know, at a time when everything was very sensitive anyway, provoking potentially hate speech towards Koreans in Japan from some people on the Japanese far right, and also provoking, you know, expressions of hatred towards Japan from some people in Korea. They have real potential to damage this already tense relationship. And if we're not careful, this will spill over into discourse in the US and in Australia, potentially causing problems in the US and Australian relationship with two of our most important East Asian partners. Meanwhile, the whole issue has been, the comfort women issue has been ramping up further, partly because a South Korean court made a ruling demanding compensation to surviving comfort women from Japan. But on the Japanese side, the Japanese government has stated that officially it will no longer use the term military comfort women because it doesn't like the association of military with the issue. And earlier this month, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party announced that one of its strategic aims for this year is a further overseas strategic dissemination push on the history wars. And since February, Ramseya's Comfort Women article has been taken up even within the political establishment. So one ruling party parliamentarian in Japan has produced a video blog urging his supporters to write to Harvard, defending Professor Ramseya's freedom of speech from his critics, and even giving them helpful suggestions on how to phrase their messages in convincing English. In March, Ramseya's article became the topic of some debate in the Education and Science Committee of the upper house of the Japanese Parliament, reportedly the first time that a specific academic article has been taken up for debate in this forum. So a member posed questions about the article, really in terms very favorable to Professor Ramseya. And in response, the Japanese Minister of Education and Science, Hagiuda Koichi, rather than sort of stepping back and saying, you know, this is not for politicians to comment on, made a statement about freedom of speech, which could be seen as implicitly siding with Ramseya and criticizing Ramseya's critics. So this whole issue, to me, it is the worst crisis of academic integrity that I've encountered in my research area in the 40 years that I've been in academia, which is why I felt I needed to talk about it today. I was originally going to talk about something different. What I think we see here is a structure of discourse very familiar to people who followed the history of things like Holocaust denial and climate change denial, where you get the dissemination of snippets of decontextualized information, misquoted sources or misleadingly quoted sources, and so on, being presented in an academic guise to promote a particular political message. But what's really worrying is that this is coming from, you know, the most respected academic source. And I think that really challenges us to find a way of dealing with this failure of academic standards, because if we don't, how can we possibly teach students to do proper research? And in a sense, what's the point of doing research at all if you can produce this sort of thing and pass it off as research? Why do we need to really seek the truth of history? So how can we prevent this, what I would call weaponization of research, particularly of fundamentally flawed research, while still energetically defending freedom of speech? And in some ways, although this article is a real problem and a headache, it may have a good consequence in making us think about this more carefully. I think, you know, in the hard sciences, things are a little bit clearer cut, and there is a clear understanding that, of course, freedom of speech prevails, but you cannot just therefore say that you have found a cure for COVID unless you can come up with the scientific experimental evidence that stands up to investigation. What you claim on your Facebook page or, over a beer in the pub is another matter, but in academia, you can't do that. But in the humanities and social sciences, I think we haven't been nearly as good at dealing with this problem. And there's a good reason for that, and that's because in the humanities and social sciences, we base our research generally on a multitude of sources, written and sometimes oral and other sources as well. And the interpretation of sources is very important. So it's really harder to separate what could be called fundamentally flawed research that doesn't meet proper academic standards, from just a somewhat eccentric interpretation of a historical document or whatever. But I think now we're being really challenged to do that. And I think that there are ways of doing it. It's not easy. But for example, in academia, we do have clear rules and processes for dealing with plagiarism. And people who break the rules face a variety of sanctions. And I think what we need to do now is to have a really careful, serious discussion about how we can extend the sort of rules we have for plagiarism to thinking about failures of research integrity in the humanities and social sciences. And maybe, as in the case of plagiarism, we need to be on the alert for certain sorts of red flags that point to possible fundamental failures of research standards. And then we need to think how often those occur, because obviously all people make mistakes, all people sometimes put in a footnote that's got the wrong page numbers on or whatever. But it's the frequency that indicates a real systematic breakdown of academic standards. And obviously, this is not just a matter of trying to, catch people who do the wrong thing or punish them or whatever. But even more importantly, it's about teaching students and teaching ourselves to identify well-founded research, to distinguish that from sloppy scholarship, and to distinguish both of those from what is basically fake news. And I think that's just, the most important academic skill today. The other thing that's come out of this article is that we really need to look again at the peer review system, because that's turned out to be very problematic in this case. But maybe we can leave discussion about peer review and so on to the discussion in a moment. But just by way of conclusion, I think that foreign influence is not a risk that emanates from a single country. It can come from multiple actors, state and non-state actors, and from within, obviously, Australia as well as outside. So a crucial response is not just to look outwards towards foreign threats, but to look inward at the systems that we have in place to protect both free speech and academic integrity from threats, again, from inside as well as from outside. Because although this current challenge to integrity in the search for historical truth has few precedents, I think it's very unlikely to be the last case of its kind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tessa. I'd like to remind our online audience that you can ask questions, greatly encouraged to do so through the Q&A facility through the Zoom website. And I do apologise for early sound problems that we have this evening. You may not have heard that. And encourage our audience here to ask questions too. I might kick off with a curiosity that around what's the contemporary Korean and Chinese government's position vis-a-vis the comfort women and the Japanese stance.
Yes, clearly a very critical position. In Korea, it's varied a little depending on which side of politics is in power, but the current Korean government has pushed Japan very hard to do more by way of apology and recompense. the very difficult issue came up because in 2015 there was a joint statement by South Korea and Japan, which was supposed to be, you know, a moment of reconciliation and really to overcome the problem. But it failed to do that because I think it just didn't represent a meeting of minds. In a sense, it sort of papered over the cracks, and then almost instantly the cracks became apparent again. So currently, the Korean government is certainly pushing Japan to do more. And currently, the court is demanding recompense for the surviving comfort women who have, I think there are only 12 women who identify themselves in Korea, more in other countries, of course.
Please.
I might not have heard every word you said, but I was wondering in terms of the topic. I mean, you were quoting one example, one author in a reputable journal, and you talked about the peer review process, which is an important topic. But I wonder, do you have actually examples of how, which is to some extent a political issue in Japan, how this foreign influence has compromised academic integrity of any Australian scholars who wanted, you hinted at it, but who wanted to work on this issue?
Yes, that's a really interesting question. And I wouldn't say that I could point to any specific example where I could say, you know, somebody has wanted to do research on this and they've been prevented from doing it. But I think that the degree of pressure that has been put on some of the prominent scholars in the field, probably implicitly, you know, has made some younger scholars feel this is such a difficult thing to get into. It's going to, you know, it's going to be really hard to do research. It's not something that can be clearly identified or quantified, but I think there are implicit pressures there that emanate particularly from the way in which some of the private lobby groups have dealt with the issue, or, you know, to be a bit more specific, there are two things that I would point to in terms of the pressures on academics who work on the issue. One is that some of them get a lot of harassing emails and Twitter messages and things like that, which, you know, for some academics is really quite a distressing thing to have to deal with. But there have been other stranger things that have happened. One in particular is the situation of one of the most prominent US researchers on the comfort woman issue, who one of the members of the groups that I talked about, the Denialist Groups, put a claim in through the US Freedom of Information law, which is, to my mind, astonishingly wide in its scope, asking her and her university to hand over to him all her university emails, all the emails on the university server that she had received or sent. She is allowed, they have to comply under US law because it's a public university, they have to comply. She can redact private information, but the result is that she spent the past 2 years or however long going through, I don't know how many emails, redacting private information before they get handed over to this guy. Now that sort of thing, you know, is quite distressing and harassing for academics. And I think the knowledge that that's going on makes it a bit harder for people to go into the field, particularly if they're thinking which area to go into in terms of their research.
Bill?
One sort of observation on which I'd appreciate your reflections, and then one specific question. The observation relates to money, because often one would say if you're looking for influence, follow the money. And something that's worried me in the university sector in Australia for a long period of time now is that the ability to raise money has been increasingly a criterion that universities have used in order to determine whether people are worthy for promotion or not. I was an external referee for a promotion applicant at an Australian university last year, and one of the most prominent questions he was being asked was how much grant money had he brought in for the university. And of course, that's the kind of thinking that got the Soviet economy into trouble, because raising resources like that is an input measure rather than an output measure. And yet that pressure is there, and it does create an incentive for people to grab the money, no matter from what compromised source it may be coming at a certain point. So I'd be interested in your reflections on how money feeds into this. The question I had related to journals and peer review. And do you think there is a greater danger of the kind of thing that we've seen in the case you cited occurring when journals are interdisciplinary rather than focused on particular areas such as Japan studies or China studies? Because I can quite understand a situation in which a referee who knew really nothing about the comfort women issue but was an economist might come cold to the matter and not necessarily appreciate just how explosive might have been the arguments being put forward in the manuscript that had been sent for review, and instead look at purely in terms of contracting or something like that.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Yes, I mean, the money issue is a really important one because, as you say, funds for research, particularly, I think, funds coming from the Australian government to support research are always, being squeezed. And so people have to go out and they have to find outside funding more and more. And it does make all sorts of areas of research vulnerable. I think with this one, I mean, clearly there are funding bodies that will support research on the comfort women issue and on other controversial World War II topics. But there'll be some bodies that won't. For all kinds of reasons. So the money issue is certainly an important one. The peer review issue, yeah, this is actually very interesting. So what happened with these, in fact, there were 3 articles, one of which has been published and probably it's too late to do anything about it. One of the ones on minorities. Then another one on the Korean minority in Japan has been taken down by the journal or sent out for re-review by the journal who published it. And then the comfort women one is also being re-examined by the journal at the moment. But with all of them, what happened, and I think this was a deliberate, looks like a bit of a deliberate strategy, was that they're couched as theoretical debates about an issue in law and economics. So the first half or so is about this theoretical debate, and then now we will move to a case study, and that's where this material comes in. So, and then they were all sent to journals in the theoretical law and economics area. And I don't know, obviously, who the reviewers were, but you can guess that most of them didn't understand the empirical material that they were looking at. But I think that raises some really interesting issues. It does kind of raise red flags again about the need for us to get out of our kind of silos. I think, we've got so much into the disciplinary silos. It should be possible for journals to recognize when they've got something that falls outside their disciplinary silo and to make sure that they've got somebody, who knows about the empirical content or whatever. But also, I think, to be honest, it sort of highlights some flaws or problems in the peer review system as a whole. I just feel like the peer review system is facing a lot of challenges because of the pressure on academics to write and publish in peer-reviewed journals. So there are more and more people writing and submitting, and fewer people have got the time to do the reviewing. So again, it maybe is a pointer to the need for some more serious debate about that as well.
Might go to a question online first and then back to the audience. Terry Lowe asks, states that Carl Minster claims in his book End of an Era there are claims that the output of journals from Chinese researchers surged from near zero in 2001 to 9.5% in 2011, which fueled a massive cottage industry of fraud, black markets and fabricated papers and guarantees of placement in domestic Chinese journals, thousands of yuan apiece. How do you view this?
Well, I know nothing about it, but it wouldn't surprise me. I think, again, this is an illustration of the problems that peer-reviewed journals are facing. And clearly, it's very important for researchers in China and in other parts of the world, particularly to try and get their articles into peer-reviewed, English language peer-reviewed journals, because that's still got this kind of kudos and this international reach. My sense, even my sense as having been quite often a reviewer for peer-reviewed journals, is that journals are just getting inundated with articles and really struggling to distinguish the ones that are proper research from the ones that may have all kinds of scholarly flaws in them.
That's right. Or to the gentleman in the front, the blue coat.
When a body donates to a university to, say, fund a particular bit of research, what influence does that body then have on the outcome of the research? Does the research come with strings attached, or do they just say, here's some money, and by the way, I'm expecting this outcome? How does that work?
Oh, well, I should probably ask some other people around the room who probably have more experience than I do. But I think, it varies enormously from organizations that have very transparent processes and where you can be pretty sure that there are no strings attached, to all sorts of funding arrangements that are done by rather kind of closed-door negotiations between the institution and the donors, where there may be strings of many kinds attached. And I think often the problem is perhaps the implicit strings as much as the explicit strings.
Is there a contract, or is it more sort of discussed over cocktail parties?
There must be people around the room who've done more of this, negotiating than I have. Bill, can you answer that one?
Well, yes, I think it does vary enormously between different universities and different funding agencies. So if you have, say, the Rockefeller Foundation offering funding to a highly reputable university, then you probably don't have to worry about it at all. But if you have a much less known funding body with a reputation for having an interest in a particular topic area, offering money to an institution that may not be awash with money, then watch out, because it may well be that there will be people in the power structures within that lesser institution who will lap up any cash that comes in their direction and not ask questions. Never's asked no question isn't told a lie. To me, I think the critical factor is whether you have a really strongly worded memorandum of understanding or an agreement which specifies that the funding agency has no control over the vetting of the specific academic content of activities that's funded. But once you have control over curriculum, control over the choice of lecturing staff, any kind of right to vet publications before they're put out, then these are all red lights, flashing red lights that really should turn one off.
But this is quite different, isn't it? When you've got a grant to an institution to set something up to, let's say, someone in history or someone in sociology getting a grant from the Australian Research Council or whatever, because there are no strings attached there. But as soon as you've got, and we've had these controversies with the Ramsey Centre and some other centres which are funded by either foundations or by governments or whatever, and there the individual academic has very much, let's say, then when I put in a research proposal to a funding body, which actually spells out what I'm going to do, and you hardly ever have restrictions there, do you?
Well, again, it's going to depend upon the funding body, because there are some funding bodies that are non-intrusive once the money goes out, and they simply just want to find out what publications have resulted at the end of the day. And then there are others which are potentially much more intrusive, even where an individual academic is concerned. You can normally smell them at some distance, but it pays to be careful. Because trust is the coin of the realm, and if you actually surrender your reputation very quickly if you take tainted money and are seen to be responding to that.
Further questions?
Just speaking about research proposals, it's not only specified what the researchers intend to do, but often their preliminary hypothesis. And this often gives idea to the sponsoring body whether they will sponsor a research proposal or not. But it's already clear what line of argument researchers might be inclined to support.
Could I add one additional point to that too, which is that I know some academics in Australia who've been turned off going to the Australian Research Council, particularly in the areas of humanities and social sciences, because of the ultimate power that the minister has to veto a grant, even if it's been approved by all the specified internal mechanisms and peer reviewers or whatever. And given that it takes an inordinate amount of time to put together an application for those Australian Research Council grants, the danger of this is that it will drive people away from applying for that kind of money if it can be knocked out by a minister and fearful of a story on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. It will drive the researcher into other arms and other hands.
Could we pass the mic to, yes.
Thank you very much. I was just struck as you were talking, and I was looking at the last little list of issues you had on the board here. I would assume that these are fundamental research no-nos that one is taught in late high school. Is this in fact an issue of foreign influence or a dropping of academic standards? I'm being a slightly, devil's advocate question here, because I guess it's perhaps the example you've given with the Ramsay research. Was he actually funded by any Japanese organisation? Where did his funding come from for that research that he did?
I don't know, is the answer.
Yeah.
Not specifically that I'm aware of. He may have been in touch with some of the groups that I mentioned, or at least one of them, beforehand, but whether that involved any funding, I really don't know. So, yes, I mean, thinking of it in terms of influence, it's not a very straightforward line of influence. But I think, in a way, what we're seeing here is part of a wider blurring of the lines of between what you can do in the blogosphere and what you can do in academia. And this process that took place most notably in the United States, I guess, under the Trump era, where all sorts of things, very far-fetched theories in some cases, started to circulate in all sorts of quarters. And I think there's really been quite a dangerous erosion of that line between what is actually research, what is reliable knowledge. And this is, an illustration of that really sort of taking another step forward in a worrying way.
And I've just really room for one highly abridged online question before, unfortunately, our time is up. Margaret Billington, thanks you for your presentation. Traverses some of the territory from that last question and asks, what can academics do about Professor Ramsay's?
Yes, so I think one of the things that's really struck me about this and really got me thinking, a lot of people thinking about it, is that Harvard is in a very difficult situation, I think, here, because as far as I can see from looking online and so on, they don't have really clear rules about those sorts of issues of academic research integrity in the humanities and social sciences. And indeed, when I looked at the ANU rules, it's pretty hazy. So actually it leaves universities in a very difficult situation as to what they can do, because if they launch an investigation and, you know, potentially penalize somebody, maybe they can be taken to court because the academic can say, well, you know, there's nothing in the rules that allows you to do this. So that's why I think it's actually really important for universities now to start thinking about having the rules there more clearly. And I think having clearer rules actually protects freedom of speech as well, because it does protect academics from kind of mischievous complaints that, you know, they said something in a lecture that somebody didn't like and therefore they ought to be sacked, you know. But what Harvard can do at the moment is really tricky. And I would have to leave it up to the Harvard guys and girls to get their brains around that one.
Very good advice. And on that note, we are out of time. I'd like to thank Professor Morris-Suzuki. Thank you, Tessa, for your presentation. And before we go, just a promo for our next event. It will be online only on Wednesday, the 28th of April, at the usual time of 6 p.m, I understand. And it'll be presented by Dr. Meriden Verrill, Director of the Australia Geopolitics Hub at KPMG, who many of you will know, and will be entitled Geopolitical Trends in the Indo-Pacific and Implications of COVID-19. So look out for that one and go to the website to enrol. Thank you.